Hello everyone, and a warm welcome to tonight's Amnesty Talks, Human Rights Crisis in the World and Why We Should Care About Them. My name is Anna Johansson. I'm the Interim Director of Amnesty Sweden. And with me, of course, I have Dr Agnès Callamard. I'll allow you to introduce yourself shortly. I just want to remind everyone here, it's fantastic to finally be able to do this again with a live audience, but please remember to turn off your phones during our conversation. And also, we will have some space for audience questions later, so if you feel like you have a question at the back of your mind, you can maybe save up for that and we'll have the chance later. And hello to everyone who is following us from our live stream via Facebook. We hope that you will enjoy the conversation too, even if you don't have the opportunity to ask any questions tonight. So, Agnès, turning to you, warm welcome to Sweden.
Thank you.
How would you introduce yourself to the people in the room?
Good afternoon, first and foremost. It's a pleasure to be here. I've come to Sweden on a number of occasions, but never as Secretary General of Amnesty International, which is my current position. I've been doing this job for the last 5 months. Before that, I was a special rapporteur on extrajudicial summary or arbitrary killings for the United Nations. A position I held alongside that of teaching at Columbia University in the United States. I've worked on human rights for most of my life. The last 10 years I focused on killings and I focused on freedom of expression. Two very strange bedfellows, but two issues that are very close to my heart. I have covered a range of other human rights issues, and at heart it's about human dignity and social justice.
Thank you. And we've already had quite a busy day here in Sweden. You've had the opportunity to meet the Prime Minister and the Foreign Minister.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Busy day indeed. Interesting meeting, I think rather friendly, but good for me, an important to meet with the officials of a country when I come to that country to get a pulse of how the government and the political environment is thinking about issues that are priorities for Amnesty. On that occasion, we talked about Afghanistan, we talked about COVID, we talked about refugees and migrants, and anti-racism, I will say, all of which were the object of good conversation. We did not agree on everything. There was quite, a common grounds at a basic level, but at an important level in terms of maybe basic values, I will say. There was quite a lot in common.
So you mentioning Afghanistan, that brings us quite nicely to tonight's topic, which is human rights crisis. Mm-hmm. I'm thinking there are a number of human rights crises around the world, Afghanistan being one of them, Myanmar, Tigray, mm-hmm. Also the situation in China, of course. I could name quite a few, and so could you, of course. But how are we to understand this, the growing number of crises?
I think the first question we need to ask is whether it's growing. I don't know what you think. I think based on the work that we do at Amnesty and the work I have done before that, there are two issues we need to confront. I don't know if the number of crises is growing, but what is certainly becoming more and more apparent and evident is the growing incapacity of the international community to address crisis. And therefore, we certainly have the impression and possibly the experience of crisis lingering and never finding any solution. Why is the international community so unable to deal with crisis. I think it is probably the outcome of the fact that this international multilateral system is has reached a stalemate. There is a conflict between various superpowers, the US, China, Russia, disrupting, I will say, the rule of the game. And this reconstruction, this conflict over who is going to drive and define the international system leads to paralysis of the Security Council, but it also leads to a multiplication of hotspots, a multiplication of reasons for the superpower to get into conflict, multiplication of proxy conflict, where those various actors use other countries' territories to fight each other, multiplication of trade wars, all of which are making this environment of ours far more unstable, far more prone to crisis, I will say. In addition to that, which is also, unfortunately, our reality, is the existence of climate crisis. And it's not something that is happening in the future. It's something that is already here. And many of the conflicts that you have mentioned, particularly in the Horn of Africa, but we could have talked about the Sahel region as well, or indeed Indo-Pakistan conflict and Afghanistan to a certain extent, there are a very strong climate dimension to the conflict. In many regions, the desertification process, the search for water, the fact that there are increasing conflict over land, over resources, all of that is creating far more instability. It's even the case in Syria, where there is a very strong very good analysis that have been made of the conflict in Syria, not only having this evident political dimension, but also having among its root causes the climate crisis. So it's with us, it's not for the future, it's already here. It means conflict, and it will mean more and more conflict as people fight for access to water, access to food, access to resources more generally. So you see a number of factors which explain greater instability and therefore greater propensity for conflict and greater incapacity to address the conflict between climate, the conflict, the reconstruction of the international system, and then of course we have what I refer to as the post-financial crisis austerity measures. Everything that happened after 2008, when the financial crisis hit, we have seen after that a multiplication of countries adopting very rigorous policies that have pushed people to the edge. The kind of really extreme market-driven liberal approach to the economy has a big price to pay. And we're seeing that in the number of people migrating, in unemployment, in people finding jobs but not being able to live of those jobs, in the multiplication of the informal sector as the only source of viable alternative. All of that is also a big source of instability. So basically we live in a world where various forces, historic or current, are collapsing, are in confronting each other, and that has meant many crises, but also inability of those who could to actually prevent or respond.
I thought we'd come back to the climate crisis. We'll talk about that a bit more, and also maybe the growing inequality both between countries and within countries, because I think that's also something to discuss. But You and I talked earlier today about the concept of people power. And I'm not sure we could agree what people power was, but when Amnesty talks about activism and how activism can contribute to change, we often use the word people power. What is your take on people power?
I'm new to Amnesty, so I'm not sure I can deliver a lecture on how Amnesty sees people power. When you, as a quasi-outsider, I will say when you hear the word people's power, you think exactly that. You think the power of the people. It's about actions, advocacy, driven by people, for people. That's how I understand people's power. It's really about us taking in our own hands our own destiny. It's about us recognizing what I've just said, that the powerful of the world, many governments are currently quite powerless in confronting many of those crises, and that some of the solution may not come from them. I'm not saying that every solution comes from the people, not at all. There is certainly a very important role for governments, for the private sector, and so on and so forth. But there is also a space for people. There is a space for civil society. There is a space, and it's a space we need to own and grab, simply because we have to acknowledge the fact that many governments right now are either unwilling or unable to listen to the demands, whether it's around climate crisis, where a lot of things is in our hands as well, either as individual consumers or indeed as political animals, demanding that our governments impose taxes on certain fuel industry, for instance. So that is something in our hands. But that's not the only way people's power can be activated. It can be activated when we simply smile to someone who is begging. It can be activated when we welcome a refugee or a migrant, when we say, when we give something, when we act in thinking of people's humanity and dignity. That too is people's power. So to me, there are many ways of understanding it, but I do know that it is really central to the way we should think of ourselves, definitely not passively. We cannot be expecting the changes, the positive changes, only to come from elected officials when they are elected. There are many occasions where we, the people, do have solutions, do have ways of acting which would bring some solution, maybe too strong a word, but certainly will carry forward the beginning of solutions to the problems we're encountering.
I think 10 million people worldwide does carry a little bit of muscle at least. But and speaking of crisis, so for example, speaking of Afghanistan, which we've talked a lot about today, in such a situation, is there something that this form of collective movement or people power, can we play a role in a crisis such as Afghanistan? And what would that role be?
Yeah. Afghanistan is a very complex scenario right now. Right now, there are people who need to get out of Afghanistan because their lives is at risk, and I don't expect us here to be able to do a great deal about it, except to put pressure on our government to do all they can to take actions, to seek evacuation, to negotiate with the power to be, so that safe route can be identified for those, particularly women and girls, who are being targeted by the Taliban. So there is something we can do in demanding that the governments and our elected officials and other officials prioritize the well-being of civil society, human rights defenders, journalists in Afghanistan. There is a lot we can do by demanding that governments do not only focus on terrorism and on migration flows when thinking of Afghanistan, that they do not simply say, let's make sure the Taliban does not reinvent Al-Qaeda, let's make sure the Taliban protect us from migration flows, and that's it. That is not what we want our government to do. So we have the power to tell our government that while countering terrorism and maybe some control over migration is okay, that cannot be driven alone, and that we expect governments to also place human rights protection centrally in what will eventually become, negotiation with the Taliban, even if it's a bit too early to talk about this at the moment. So the point here is that even if there is not a direct action for the people of the Taliban, of Afghanistan, there is certainly a lot we can do with people who can influence the destiny of the people of Afghanistan. And these are politicians, elected officials, governments. They need to hear what we want. They need to hear what we have to say and what needs to be done in our name. Other than that, I think right now a lot of work in Afghanistan itself is driven by people who understand very well the country, people who can operate in that very difficult environment, people who can provide essential services and supplies and so on. The other thing we can do as Swedish or French or British is to tell our government again, or to take actions where it's possible, to welcome the Afghans who have been lucky enough to leave their country. That is something in our hands. We can, we can participate to any kind of movement, organization that support and provide services to refugees and migrants from Afghanistan. We can demand that our migration policies, refugees policies make it easier for those being targeted by the Taliban to exit and to find refuge in our own countries. We can participate to welcoming them at local level. A number of cities around the world and in Europe in particular have said we will have programs for Afghan refugees. That's something that we, the people, can also support. So I think even in a crisis as complex as Afghanistan, where it's still very unclear what's going to happen eventually, although it doesn't look good wherever you want to look. Even in those situations, even at that point of the crisis, there is still a lot that we can do as people, as citizens, as members of communities, as
neighbors.
Neighbors.
I think that's an important point that you raise about also helping to counter the narrative that is forming. We talked earlier today about how it was that only hours after the airport in Kabul fell, that immediately European politicians started talking about the importance of keeping people out, making sure that Afghan refugees didn't arrive here.
That was quite shameful, actually. I mean, I was really angry about it. Literally, within a few hours or a few days of the Taliban being in power, a number of politicians, including the French president, made a speech. And one section of that speech was that we wanted to see Afghans being controlled so that they do not, come to our lands. That was being said at the very time when people that had fought alongside us, our allies, women who had embraced a vision of the world which is ours in many ways, human rights defenders, journalists who had created that vibrant space for press freedom in Afghanistan, as they were confronting the Taliban on their own because we had buggered off quickly and in a mess, And in addition to having made such a mess of it, we then are saying, oh, and by the way, stay where you are, because we really don't want you to be coming in mass to our countries. I mean, it was the most uncivil, uncivilized things to be said at that particular point in time. So yes, we must absolutely, ensure that the communication space around refugees and migrants is not dominated by one narrative only. It may be true that we won't be able to counter everything, because right now the toxic narratives are very present in all sectors of society. But we still need to be there. We need to be present. We need to be talking about the contribution that migrations and refugees are doing economically. Today I was told, I think, that 40% of all people who care for the elderly in Sweden are of...
Sjukvårdsbiträden, säger jag då på svenska.
Yeah. Are from...
of immigrant background.
Immigrant background. 40%. Imagine if they were not here. And it is the same in many European countries, by the way. They feed us, they take care of our elderly people. There are a lot of immigrants in the nursing sector as well. They occupy positions which have been at the front line of the fight against COVID. That is a kind of narrative we need to put out, because the toxicity around refugees and migrants is so damaging to our very soul. It's not just damaging to the people to which it is addressed, and that of course is the case, but what it says about us and how much we are losing as well our humanity every time that narrative is being advanced. That too we need to counter.
Yes, I think I hear some murmuring, so I think people are seeing that this is something that we can do. I want to ask you something else. It's also something that we talked about today, and it's what you were touching upon before. This is a human rights issue, although it's often not framed as a human rights issue, and it's the growing inequality between countries and within countries. I think it's been very clear during the pandemic, the consequences of this. Why do you think it's important that we see this issue through a human rights lens?
Look, that inequality, first and foremost, is the product of human rights violations often. It is resulting in human rights violations, and it may be at heart a human rights violation. Why am I saying that? I mean, let's take the example of COVID. Around the world, people who died of COVID were people that were structurally or systematically already vulnerable, either because of their economic situations or by implications because of their access to poor healthcare, or because of working in the informal sector and being on the front line of fighting or responding to COVID. As you know, one of the very important figures, I think, is the realization that in countries where figures have been collected, it became quickly evident that people in the US of African American background were 3 times more likely to die of COVID than white Americans. The same figures were found in the United Kingdom, and I think you told me that this may be reflecting as well figures here in Sweden between immigrant and Swedish, of people of Swedish background. So that inequality in opportunities, inequalities in terms of access to healthcare, is also resulting into inequality in terms of life and death. And it is clearly an inequality which is driven by race, driven by socioeconomic background, driven by caste. In India, it was an inequality that was also driven by gender. For instance, during COVID, women and girls may not have been more affected by COVID in terms of their death, but they certainly were because so many services were cut off, including services such as sexual and reproductive health were cut off because they were found to be not essential. They were therefore affected directly by COVID. And the inequality between those who were dependent on those services and women better off that could access them through a private system is evident. So inequality of opportunities, inequalities of access, inequalities in terms of outcome, all of that is pervasive right now in our societies. It is the regions that are being created, should be of key priority for us, because these are gaps and sources of tensions. They are sources of conflict. They divide. They reinforce, something that we thought we had fought against historically. So inequality for me is extraordinarily dangerous for us as a people. We're talking about people's power here. We need to do everything that we can to fight it because of what it is. It's also the case at the moment that inequality is not just within our society, it's also between countries. I mean, COVID, again, is a very good example. I'm citing COVID because it is, we can't turn our head away from it. It's right in our face. Right now, most rich countries have vaccinated up to 70-80% of their population. They are even vaccinating 12-year-olds. There are a lot of low-income countries that have not vaccinated even one nurse at the moment. So the gap between what we privileged individuals are able to access versus the situation in most of Africa, in India as well. I mean, people are getting vaccinated in India, but it is very slow, and it is certainly right now very much the case that it is the middle class and the upper class that are have primarily access to vaccination. It's not just the case for India. The gap is unbelievable, and it means death. It's a gap between who survives and who dies. It's a gap between whose life matters and whose life does not. And right now, in the way the international system is dealing with COVID, frankly, the life that matters are the lives in Western Europe, the United States, Canada, Japan, Australia, and a few others. Okay? The lives that does not are the lives in many countries in Africa, in Asia, in Latin America. It is a reality. That is why the WHO is, constantly demanding of the countries, of the government, of the Western government, that please redistribute the vaccines that you do not need. There is a 500 million doses in excess right now in this world, meaning that the Western governments, the Western countries that have vaccinated 80% of their population still have 500 million doses in excess that they could redistribute through the COVAX system. That is not being done. COVAX, which is a special instrument established in order to ensure equity in the redistribution of the vaccine, COVAX more often than not has nothing to redistribute. So Amnesty International is going to call for, call on government. Oh, okay, sorry.
So what is Amnesty going to do about that?
Well, I mean, we have done a lot already. We've done quite a few actions, as you know, directing them at the big pharmaceutical companies and at some governments. Next week, we're going to launch a new campaign, which is a 100 days countdown, where we're going to multiply our energy, all of us together, the 10 million members, people's power, trying to really push our government and pharmaceutical companies to ensure that within 100 days we can at least have 40% and above of the population of the lower and middle income countries being vaccinated. There is right now an attempt as well to see whether within a year 70% of the population of the lower and middle income countries could be vaccinated. We need to understand that as long as people either do not have access to treatment or do not have access to vaccination, we cannot combat effectively that COVID. It's just not gonna be the case. So it is, even for our own self-interest, really important that we step up. And for me, I feel it is important to tell our government, it's again about people's power, to tell our government, not in my name. You cannot be hoarding vaccine doses in my name. It cannot be. In my name, I want you to be equitable and just.
Of course, that's a very fundamental human rights issue, isn't it? The right to life.
Exactly.
And I'm also thinking, and I've heard you say this as well, Agnès, that this is a human rights issue where we actually know the solution. Yeah. It's right there in front of us. So,
talking about crisis, it's very rare in our world. It's very rare in the human rights field that you confront massive human rights violation and you have a solution. It's almost unheard of. And here we have a COVID, which has killed 5 million people and is probably twice that much. And we have the solution, and yet we're not acting on it. That's quite unbelievable. Why? That's a question I'm always asking myself. Why, when the economists have asked, please act? Why, when UN has asked and said, please act? Why, when bankers, Christine Lagarde, the head of the European Bank, has said, we have the money, it will be a fraction of what we're currently spending on fiscal recovery. That's all that is needed to vaccinate or to offer vaccination to the rest of the world. And yet we're not doing it. Why? I think that's the question we need to ask ourselves. Why?
Thank you. I'm now going to move on to the climate. We're touching on the big issues here tonight. We're talking about Afghanistan, we're talking about COVID. Now we're moving on to the climate crisis. And you started talking about this. I mean, Amnesty has rightfully pointed out the link between the climate crisis and human rights. And this is a human rights crisis that is affecting all of humanity. Mm-hmm. What do you think, and I know this is a difficult question to answer maybe, but what do you think the fight for climate justice will require of us as an organisation? What will it require of Amnesty?
Of Amnesty? I think first it requires that we all be convinced that climate justice is a fight for us, and I'm not sure yet that we have reached that level of awareness. We will need to find the tools to work on that topic. It's not straightforward. It's not, it feels daunting. There are already a lot of organizations, Greenpeace, and many others that are working on on climate crisis. What can we add is a question. So I think from an Amnesty standpoint and from a human rights standpoint, it is really important for people to understand that the climate crisis is a question of rights. It's a question of people's dignity, people's livelihood, people's right to life. It's a question of, indeed, it's also a matter of civil and political rights, because many of people who dare challenge actions or activities that are bad for the climate and the environment often find themselves the first target of acts of violence. You know, environmental defenders are the greatest number of victims the world over in terms of who is killed and who is imprisoned. So climate is at heart, not only, but it is at heart a human rights issue. It's an existentialist issue for our humanity. By unpacking the climate dimension of existing conflict, I think we can also find other ways of addressing what's happening and maybe finding better solution to all the crises you were talking about. It is not possible currently to understand the conflict in the Sahel region just by looking at terror groups. Of course they are there. Why are they there? Why are they popular? Why are people joining them? Are they only there because of the threats and the violence, or are they there because they've lost all sources of income and livelihood because of climate crisis, because of the desertification? You know, it's one of the drivers. It's not the only one, but by understanding conflict and war through the lenses of climate, yes, we're making solutions more complex, but we are also making solutions more possible, because frankly, 20 years into the war on terror, we still have not gone very far. So climate is, you know, it's about solidarity with those communities that are on the front line of the climate conflict, whether they are in the Pacific, whether they are in Bangladesh, whether they are indigenous communities. Many communities are about to lose their territories. They are about to lose their land. They are about, because of the rising sea level, for instance, you know. How do we work in solidarity with these communities? What do we do for them? That has great implications from a human rights standpoint. So, you know, I think we need to be there to provide more ammunition to the narrative and the advocacy around climate. We need to make it more, you know, it's really about peoples. It's about it's about their rights. It's about their future. It's about our children. We can contribute all of that. We can contribute through the usual advocacy, but also litigation measures. We can do more around the responsibilities and obligations of governments when it becomes a human rights issue that opens up a range of tools that may not be there if you only construct that question from an environmental standpoint. So I think we have a lot that we can contribute and add.
Mm-hmm. I think we'll have opportunities to talk more about this over the coming years. The fight for climate justice is one of the priorities for Amnesty going forward. So I thought now I would ask if there are any questions in the audience. And if you have a question, please raise your hand. Please state your name and also try to keep it brief. And that way we might be able to hear from a few more people. And we have a microphone there as well. You'll have a short break while everyone feels brave enough to raise their hand.
I was wondering how is the international community to reverse the negative trend regarding climate change?
To reverse it, I think it's too late. At this point in time, we can't reverse what we have done. I mean, you know, the destruction is so advanced. But what we need to do is take steps now so that it doesn't deteriorate further. The key issues is around how much can we tolerate the temperature to increase. You know, is it 1.2? Is it 2? Is it 2.5? I mean, surely we should try to stick to the Paris Agreement. At the rate we're going now, you know, the 1.5 increase is way off our possibilities. We're gonna completely miss it. So in order to miss that 1.5 increase, we need to really reverse a great deal of practices around, particularly fossil fuel. Is that how you call it? Yeah. So, you know, I think it's also, you were asking, there was also a question about us as people as well. I think as consumers, there is a lot we can do. I know everyone here recycle probably and does a lot of things, but there is probably far more that we ought to do around even our own diet. And you know, climate, whether we go for mitigation or transformation, or it's going to have a drastic impact on everyone's life. It may take a bit longer to reach us here in Sweden, but it would. But at the moment, notwithstanding everything related to human rights, which needs to be unpacked, but right now, according to the scientific evidence that we have accumulated at Amnesty, in particular to prepare for working on climate, it is very clear that we are not going to meet the Paris climate agreement of 1.5 increase. And let's recall that 1.5 increase in the temperature is already very high, you know, because we're not there. And have you seen what happened that summer? So, you know, everybody that I read, that I speak to, they can only say you need to really have a very drastic change of policy, and I don't see that happening at the moment.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Yes, hello. A question. What is your view on Amnesty's future strategy? We have a bit an ongoing discussion. Amnesty started originally with the fight for prisoners of conscience. Then it included work against torture and the work against the death penalty. And at the moment we feel we have this ongoing discussion that we try to cover a lot of areas, but I mean we still have the death penalty, although slowly declining. Torture is a horrible, widely existent problem, etc. So how do you see the split of our resources between all those the traditional cause subjects and areas like climate change and the effects of climate change, etc. So where would you see how Amnesty should move or develop, in which direction?
Sure, I think it's going to be a question of strategies, tactics, and impact. The work on the work on death penalty has had tremendous success. Yes, death penalty still exists, but when Amnesty started, I can't remember the exact statistics, but I will imagine that there was a majority of countries that practice death penalty, and right now they have shrunk. And every year we see more countries either adopting a moratorium or, in fact, passing into law the abolition of death penalty. So the progresses have been very large. There is still the United States, Iran, China, Saudi Arabia, and of course efforts need to continue there. But we should not invest in the fight against penalty the same level of energy we did when the majority of countries practiced it. It's a far less, it's still a violation, but it is far less important in terms of the number of countries and people than it was then. So we can reallocate those resources to something else. Torture is a different issue. Torture is still unfortunately very practiced, and in fact I suspect it's probably has not decreased as much as we would like to, even though we have had several successes in the fight against torture. We just, when it comes to torture, need to reflect on how do we fight torture effectively. If we've tried as an organization to eradicate torture for the last 60 years, or let's say 50 because it came later, and that we have not been able to do that, and in fact we may not have had a great deal of impact except on specific individuals, I think the conclusion is that we need to really rethink thoroughly how we tackle and how we confront torture, and that maybe the way we've done it is not the right way. The way we've done it may not deliver the kind of impact that is required, and as an organization we need to, we need to take stock of that. We need to really be prepared to hear the harsh, the difficult lesson. The practice of torture in many places is really part of police culture. How do we radically transform the police culture in places such as, India, to name one? That is some of the questions I think that need to drive us right now, and it's not so much a question of resources, it may be a question of reflection. Now, I think the question, is it sensible for Amnesty to look at a range of other human rights issues when the ones at its foundation have not all been tackled? I think it is important for Amnesty, which is the largest human rights organization in the world, which is a unique human rights organization by its structures and its platform. It is really important for Amnesty to take a stand on issues which otherwise will not receive the attention they deserve from a human rights standpoint. Amnesty was born in an era where the world was very much fighting each other, and one of the fight was around what mattered, civil rights or economic rights. Amnesty is a product of that fight. We adopted one side, which was to say we're going to fight on the side of those who believe civil and political rights matter more than economic, social, and cultural rights. We were part of that. We were part of this construction of human rights. Even though we've advocated for indivisibility, we never practiced it. I believe that as we enter another era of conflict, normative conflict, between the US and China, the fight over values is going to be central. It's not going to just be who has the greatest army, who can send in the sky the biggest rockets. It's also going to be who can capture the attention of people, who can create a normative, a legal, a value-based framework that brings us together. For China, it's going to be clearly on national sovereignty, stability, and economic growth. For the other side, let's say the US, to be to take a shortcut, if the US is to say the only thing that matters is civil and political rights, they're gonna lose. They're gonna lose. And frankly, I don't want, it's not that I want the US or China to win, but I certainly want my dignity and my rights to remain central to the construction or the reconstruction of the world. For me, it is essential that as a human rights organization, we own economic issue. We really make it part of our ethos. We do not let issues related to stability, issues related to economic growth being driven by a country like China or Russia. We have to say stability is a right. Economic growth is a right. It's about economic rights. It's about a range of issues related to that. It does not mean that as an organization we're going to work tirelessly over those questions. But as an organization which is so central to defining human rights, we need to be able to stand strong on the fact that human rights in 2021, as in fact in 1960, are indivisible. We need to be very prepared to say that when a community in Bangladesh is going to lose all access to its livelihood, you can address it as you wish, but we can say that too is a rights issue. And we need to say that because if we don't, that population, that community, that situation is going to be defined through other means, which will not be supportive of something driven by dignity and equality. So I see the role of Amnesty as one of recognizing the dignity of all, insisting on the fact that people who may not be tortured or who may not face this penalty still are important rights holders, and we need to be able to tell their stories, and we need to be actors in the construction of the multilateral system that is being redefined at the moment. We cannot let that being done by either China, who is going to grab economic and stability issue, or by the US, who's going to say the only thing that matters is civil and political rights. We're going to be there and we're going to say absolutely not. We want a world that is predicated on the indivisibility of rights. We want a world that is predicated on the fact that as human beings, we need food and we need freedom. And we want to fight for them all.
Thank you. I think we have time for one more question.
We have two.
Two more questions.
Short.
Two short questions.
Well, I don't know. My name is Helena Rojas, and I was thinking of, actually you have said a lot, but I think about the word dignity and how Amnesty is going to act in the world right now, in all this. And I'm thinking of how we talk about things, because the word dignity is very cross-political. I think it's a very good word because there are not many people in the world that doesn't accept that everyone has the right to dignity, and I think Amnesty maybe should find more of that kind of words, that you can't like say this is not important. What I try to say is that I feel sometimes, I'm not afraid that we don't have the solutions, but I'm more afraid that people think that the solutions are so complex, so they look the other way, So I think we have to get back to that, the dignity of each one in this. What I'm trying to say is that I think Amnesty should try to talk more, find a new language, level up the language about this to try to reach out. It's not easy, but that's what I am thinking a lot right now. How can we talk about this to make more people to join, the idea of human rights and human dignity? And I think that's a very big mission, important mission for Amnesty to do that.
Thank you. I mean, it's almost more a question for you, no? In Sweden, how can you reinvent the language for of dignity. I mean, I think it's a very good observation. I do believe that as a human rights organization with a long history, we have a lot to build upon. I think, you mentioned torture. I mean, Amnesty was a driver in raising awareness about how terrible torture is. We were instrumental in the adoption of the of the Convention Against Torture. It's a fundamental instrument in the fight against torture. So we have a lot to build upon. We have this long history. But we cannot just be looking backward. We also need to acknowledge that the world of 2021 is different, that there are new generations, that there are people who claim, something that they would never have claimed in 1960, such as I'm neither a man nor a woman. Completely radical. Can you think of a more radical way, of a more radical challenge to society? This binary movement, trans movement. I mean, it's extraordinarily challenging. We are, climate crisis is there, right there in at our footstep. Lots of climate migrants, refugees, the artificial intelligence, robotics. That's something that is of great interest to me, so I follow it quite closely. They are, what's his name? That man who went, one of the guys that went...
Which one?
The one who is also driving cars. What's his name?
Elon Musk.
Yes. So he's working at the moment on the creation of robots whose focus will be the provision of home care services, and actually that's very much part, if you like, science fiction. It's something that you will find in a lot of science fiction. The first robots in science fiction are always robots for this kind of activities. His vision of the world is a vision where eventually all home care activities, cleaning the house and so on, will be done by robots. Can you imagine the implication that this would have, first of all, on the many people who rely on that for their employment, but most importantly on we, the people? What does that mean to be human in, let's say, 2050? Can we imagine a world where robots will not just be the product of good programs, but could somehow learn of their own, could become, in fact, could even learn compassion? Then what do we do when we live in a world where a creation by human is learning to become human? What does that mean to be human? I'm saying that because this is not far away from us. It's actually, I will say, 20, 30 years away from us. And these are things that we need to start thinking about. I'm not answering your question, but what I am saying, I understand what you're talking about. I think the younger generation, of whom there are quite a few representatives here, probably feel it, capture it. They want to create a language and a movement and an action that reflect the fact that their world is really different from ours, and that it's going to be so fundamentally different. So fundamentally different. That industrial revolution, this technology revolution is probably going to create such profound transformation in our society. So yes, we do need to create the language, the vision, the framework, if not now, but certainly for very, very soon.
I'm looking at the clock, and I think it's possibly time to wrap up. I wonder, Agnès, just to...
I thought there was another question. But...
No. Well, we might have time to continue in the hall, but I think we are going to have to let our live stream go. So I just want to say a warm thank you to you for being here today. I think that deserves a round of applause. And I also want to say to everyone else a warm thank you for being here. If you want to join us again, our next Amnesty Talks is on the 21st of September. It's about the situation in Eritrea.
Oh, very good.
And also a conversation about what it means to have a close relative incarcerated. So please join us for that. Thank you very much. There will be no fading music because this isn't a TV show, but I think our live stream has left us there. Do we want to have our last question as well before we wrap up here?